Hello, my name's Ben Wilson. I'm the ACCA's expert tutor for the advanced auditing paper. And in this session, we're going to be focusing on quality management. Quality management is being tested really regularly in the AAA exam, so I wanted to focus here for this tutorial. Now, we tend to see quality management in section B of the exam. Often a full 20-mark question or 25-mark question with the 5 professional skills marks, or perhaps 12 to 15 marks out of the 20 to 25-mark question. A significant proportion of the exam. And the reason the examiner really likes to test quality management is because the questions are always really different. Yes, you have to comment on the quality of the audit or matters to consider and evidence you'd expect to be on file. Those are standard questions, but the scenarios are always really different. Lots of different issues they can test. To confirm your understanding of how an audit really works, because if you can evaluate when one's been done badly, it means you must know what a good audit looks like. And it allows them to bring in a wide range of different issues into the same question. There might be a bit of ethics. There might be some financial reporting. There could be some poor practice from the auditors. Lots of different things the examiner can build into a single question to really test your understanding. So I'm going to disappear off screen and we're going to go through the session agenda for today. So, starting with a bit of a recap of quality management to make sure you've got the background understanding and technical knowledge that you need. Then I'm going to go through a few issues that students typically have with quality management questions. And I'm going to give you my top tips on how to avoid those issues. Then there's a demonstration of good practice. How do you go about doing a quality management question? Well, I'm going to show you. So let's start with the topic recap first of all, quality management. Now, it's a relatively simple topic. There isn't that much detail to know, but you do need to understand what a good audit looks like. So a high quality audit, well, it has 3 elements to it. Firstly, it'll be well directed. That means tone at the top. That means that the leaders of the audit, that's the audit partner really, is setting a good example for the junior auditors, the more junior members of the team. And they do that by demonstrating due care and attention to their work. They do that by having a kickoff meeting with the audit team to brief them on the client and any issues that they're facing. If an audit is well run and well directed, it means that we've got a much better chance of the audit work being done to a higher degree of quality. Now, the second phase or part of quality management is about supervising the audit. And that means, well, an audit is generally done, most of the work is done by relatively junior auditors. When I was at KPMG working in audit, on some of the smaller audits I was on, there was actually only 2 of us on site, me as the junior auditor and an audit senior, or I would have been called the audit assistant. That's the modern terminology. But the audit senior was there to supervise me. And that means answering any questions I had when I first started and I didn't really know what I was doing. To have a more senior person on site who could supervise me and answer questions as they came up, so that if I had problems with my work or I didn't understand how to do something, there was someone there who could help me. Now, on bigger audits, and I worked on some really big ones, I worked on some FTSE 100 listed companies, big listed companies like TUI Travel. Well, the audit team there on site, there were loads of us. But the little bit that I worked on, we had a partner, a senior manager, a manager, a few audit seniors and some audit assistants as well. And the more senior members of the team are there to make sure that the more junior members are comfortable with the work that they're doing and are supervising it to make sure it stays on track. And the final stage about a high quality audit is everything should be reviewed. Now, that means that the work performed by the most junior auditor, well, they really should be working on the more simple areas, things like cash, and fixed assets or property, plant and equipment, the more routine areas of the audit, their audit work would be reviewed by a more senior member of the team, perhaps the audit manager, or maybe even the audit senior. But the more advanced, more difficult, more subjective, more risky areas of the audit, those would be done by a more senior auditor, perhaps the audit senior, or maybe even the audit manager. And their work would be reviewed by, again, a more senior auditor, perhaps the manager or even the audit partner. And that work I was mentioning for the junior auditor who might be auditing cash and property, plant and equipment, well, if there's anything interesting in their work, some misstatements that have been found or something unusual, it wouldn't just be their more immediate supervisor that would review their work. It would also be reviewed by the audit manager and perhaps the audit partner as well. So lots of review work. And we're going to be coming back to reviews shortly. So features of a high quality audit, if it's going to be done really well. The team needs to have enough time to plan, perform, and to do reviews of the audit work before the audit report is signed. And we'll very often find in a scenario-based question that there isn't enough time, particularly around planning. We might be asked to do the work late, right? A last-minute request to do the audit, or a last-minute request to perhaps do some non-audit work, like some due diligence work. And that planning time is really important so that the senior auditors who are setting out the audit plan have enough time to consider the issues that the business is facing. They have enough time to book appropriate staff to the work. Now, the doing side, there tends to be enough time there in a scenario-based question. It doesn't tend to be that the actual work is performed under pressure, although it may well be. And if we're having to do things quickly, you know what it's like in the exam, don't you? If you've got to work under time pressure, you're much more likely to miss things. And with the reviews, there needs to be enough time, not just to do the review for the manager or the partner to review the audit work, but there needs to be enough time to address any issues that are found as part of that review. So in an exam question, always be looking out for time, right? Things very often will have been done under time pressure, which will reduce their quality. Next, an audit needs to be appropriately staffed. Yeah, if it's a small, simple business, we can have a small junior audit team because they're probably not going to be facing any particularly subjective or technical issues. So a junior auditor who's not that experienced can probably do the audit work to a high degree of competence. But if it's a complicated business, a new audit client, or a large listed company, for example, well, it should be a more senior team because that more senior team are going to have the experience that's required to be able to identify misstatements. You'll very often find in a quality management question that work is being performed by staff that are too inexperienced or not qualified enough to be able to do the work properly. High risk areas given appropriate focus. Now, in an audit, there will be riskier areas and less risky areas. When I say risky, I mean subjective, really, where there's lots of management judgment and real scope for there to be errors, perhaps something really technical. So any area that is identified as being particularly high risk, well, have a think about it. What should be the appropriate response for the audit team? Yeah, it should be things like a more senior auditor should be doing that work. It should be reviewed more thoroughly by a more senior auditor than the auditor who performed the work. And it absolutely should be very well supervised because the person performing that work will need to be able to discuss any issues with a more experienced auditor so that they can do the work robustly. And back to reviews. Those reviews have to be performed by the right people. Now, what do I mean by right? Well, the first thing about a review of someone else's work, it should always be done by someone who is more senior. So the audit junior's work, I've already mentioned this, should be reviewed as a minimum by the audit senior. But if it is a particularly high risk area of the audit, then it shouldn't just be the audit senior that reviews it. And it shouldn't just be the audit manager that reviews it. It should definitely be the audit partner as well. And finally, if there are any ethical threats, and there absolutely will be in a scenario-based question, well, they should be mitigated with appropriate safeguards. So if there are things like a self-review threat that you identify in the scenario, well, then we should have a separate audit team. Or if it's things like a familiarity threat, then we should really be getting something like an independent partner review to make sure that that self-interest or familiarity threat hasn't reduced the quality of the audit work that's been performed. All of these, all 5, are things that we look for in scenarios because they won't have been done. You know, the high-risk areas won't have been performed by the most senior auditor. Reviews won't have been done by the right person at the right time. It will be someone who's too junior or they've done it too quickly. And there will be ethical threats in the scenario that haven't been adequately mitigated with safeguards. You know, if we have got a fee dependency issue or a self-interest threat, then we should be declaring it to those charged with governance. And they probably won't have done in the scenario. You can see, just looking at this list, how varied the issues are that they can write into a quality management question, and therefore why it is something that the examiner absolutely loves to test. On to reviews in a little bit more detail, and I wanted to just discuss the different types of reviews that happen on an audit. Well, firstly, the reviews have to be timely, right? They have to be done at an appropriate point with enough time left before we complete the audit to address any issues. And they have to be done by a more senior auditor than the auditor who performed the work. I've already covered these points. Let's get on to the good stuff. That's our standard reviews, right? Or just the standard reviews that happen during an audit. But here come the extra ones. If it is a listed client or a public interest entity or a high-risk audit, so that basically means in a scenario, any listed company or any particularly risky company or particularly public interest in that organization, then there should be an engagement quality control review. Now, this is also called a hot review. And what happens in an engagement quality control review is an independent partner who has not been involved in the audit and is sufficiently senior to be able to robustly challenge the audit partner. This independent partner goes through the audit file a little bit, maybe reviews some of the more contentious areas and discusses any areas that look challenging with the audit partner, and they will challenge the audit partner on the conclusions that have been drawn. The idea here is this is an independent second pair of eyes and a very experienced pair of eyes to challenge what's happened during the audit to make sure that the audit opinion we're giving is correct. It is supported by the evidence on the file. The point of a hot review or an engagement quality control review is to make sure that the audit opinion we give is correct. So this is done before the audit report is signed. The other type of review that we see is a performance improvement review or a cold review. And this is done after the event, after the audit report is signed. And the idea here is that we're learning lessons. We're learning lessons for later audits. We're looking at, is all the documentation on file correct? Has everything been done that is supposed to have been done? Is that file robust? And are there any lessons we can learn from that audit that we can apply to future audits? Now, I've put here that this is done for a selection of audits. When I was at KPMG, I typically would have one of my audit files pulled every couple of years, so it's not every audit, it's maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 10 audits that might be pulled out for review by an internal team. And this tends to be performed by a manager, an audit manager. It's not a partner that does this because it's more of a procedural review to make sure that the firm's audit processes were followed properly. Now, that topic recap went over the main points, the important bits that you need to know about quality management to succeed in the exam. But if you want more on quality management, a great place for you to go for extra reading is in the Study Hub. And you log into the Study Hub, you'll have the link from ACCA. And when you first log in, it brings up the study text. And it's organised by chapters. And the one that's useful for this section of the course for quality management is, well, as the name suggests, Chapter 5 Quality Management. And you can go in here and do extra reading on the different parts of a quality management system. Now, another thing that's really useful on the Study Hub, you've got some quizzes in here, which you can do one on Chapter 5. Look, I only got 60% when I clicked through this one earlier. Maybe I need to go back and do it again. And you've also got flashcards. And if you filter the flashcards by chapter, Chapter 5 is our quality control or quality management section, it brings up flashcards here for you to work through. So it gives you a definition or something. So here, a system of quality management. You have to have a think about what that is. Have a think. What is a system of quality management? And once you've had a thought about it, you can click on the flashcard and it will bring up the textbook definition. Now, a word of warning. AAA is not an exam that you pass by memorising textbook definitions. So it's always good to have a kind of more realistic, more real world definition in your own mind. So the system of quality management, for me, it's how the audit firm sets out a process to make sure that the quality of audit work performed is sufficiently robust. And there are lots of elements of that system of quality management, like the staffing, like the planning of the audit, like the reviews, like the direction of it, all the stuff that we covered in that earlier recap. All of those add together to the system of quality management. The next flashcard, the Engagement Quality Control Reviewer. You know who that is, don't you? We kind of recapped it. Yeah, you know who should do it, don't you? Don't you? Yes, it should be a senior independent partner. So let's look at the definition. Ooh, now this gives us a little bit extra because it's not just a partner. It can be another individual in the firm, but that individual must be senior enough to have enough clout, enough robust ability to be able to hold the audit partner to account. So generally it's an independent senior partner who hasn't worked on the audit, or it could be an external individual. That's pretty unlikely because that would incur a cost and also have confidentiality issues. But yes, it could be someone outside the audit firm. Now, what have we got next? Flashcard 3. Oh, the engagement team. This one less useful. It's talking about the people on the audit. Who does the audit? Well, it's the auditors. But the engagement team doesn't include anyone who is outside of the audit firm, like an external expert or the internal auditors. And our fourth and final flashcard is what is an engagement quality control review? Now, this one for me, do you remember the alternative words for this? Yes, it's a hot review. And the idea of a hot review or an engagement quality control review or an EQR is to make sure that we're giving the right audit opinion. We do the engagement quality control review before the audit report is signed to make sure there's enough evidence on the file to support that audit opinion. And the audit partner is challenged about their judgments and contentious areas before that audit report is signed. Now, the definition in here is, well, it's kind of saying the same thing, but in much longer, less real language. And it's a useful lesson for the exam. I would avoid trying to write like this. Okay, this is like a textbook. What the examiner is trying to see in your answer is that you've understood what the particular thing is, and therefore writing it in your own language that shows you've understood it is more likely to score you credit. So that's how I'd be using the chapters, the flashcards, and I'd also be practicing using the quizzes within the Study Hub, a really useful resource that's now being provided by ACCA. Right, common issues in a quality management question. And actually, a lot of these are not just for quality management questions, they're for a wide range of questions, but they do apply to quality management. The first issue is that a lot of students focus on rote learning, memorizing the textbook on quality management, memorizing some past exam answers on quality management. And that is a problem. The reason it's a problem is that in AAA, you get very few marks for demonstrating knowledge. For showing that you've learnt the textbook, you might earn 1 mark in a 20-mark question, or maybe 2 marks, but certainly nowhere near enough marks to be able to pass it. So memorizing the textbook and then writing out what you've learnt is not helpful because it doesn't score marks. And if you have memorized some previous exam answers and you write those answers that you've memorized from a previous exam question that looked a bit similar, well, it won't score because every scenario has hugely different risks in it. Okay, and subtle differences. The linkages between the different issues in the scenario will mean that you end up needing to write a very different answer to a quite similar looking quality management question. So if your approach is, I'm going to learn the answer to a previous exam question, it will not work in AAA because the scenario will be different in the question you're given in the exam, so your rote learned answer won't score. The second issue that students have is they only score half a mark for their points when they could score a full mark. They don't seal the deal. They don't complete their point. They have a bruh. They have a, rather than have a. Actually, do you know what this advert is for? If you're in the UK, you know what this advert is. Have a break, have a Kit Kat. Anyway, without that extra bit here, it doesn't make sense, does it? And that's often the case with student answers because they're half finished. Their points haven't been fully developed. So because those student answers lack detail, they tend to only score half a mark rather than a full mark. What you always have to do in a quality management answer is start with a fact from the scenario or facts, and then explain why those facts from the scenario lead to an issue around quality. Lowering audit quality generally is what will happen. And that's the bit that most student answers miss. Okay, third issue in a quality management question, and again, this applies across a wide range of questions, not just here, is that students repeat themselves. And the problem of repeating yourself by using that same explanation again and again is that it won't score twice. Right? Once you've said something, it will not score again if you use exactly the same explanation. This is the case in a quality management question. It's also the case in things like audit procedures, where students suggest, I don't know, discuss with management several times around different things. It'll only score once. Don't repeat yourself. So because you won't score more than once for the same point, you cannot do that. That needs to be in your mind that I'm not going to repeat myself. Right, so my top tips then for how we avoid those issues. The first one is around using the scenario fully. Now, this applies in every question, but particularly in quality management. So I try to start each point in my answer with a fact or facts from the scenario, the quality management issue that I've identified. And what I ideally try to do in each of my points is bring in more than one fact. And they'll probably be in different parts of the scenario. So I have to plan effectively so that I can draw out facts from different parts of the scenario that link together to tell a more complete story. My second tip, and this is about getting that full mark rather than a half mark, is I keep looking back at the requirement. Okay, and I look back at the requirement, and when I'm writing up my point, I try to bring my point back to the specific requirement. Okay, I explain why each point causes a quality management issue. Why does it lower audit quality? And, well, actually, this links in with my first tip. I am heavily using the scenario to illustrate my issues. I am not writing a pre-learned, rote-learned point. I am using the scenario to explain why this issue causes a problem for quality on the audit. I love that quote. Okay, read it again. If you didn't find it funny first time, read that quote again. Okay? You cannot repeat yourself. If you use the same argument twice, it won't score the second time. So you need to come up with a second or different explanation. Or if you do need to use the same sort of thing, because it is similar, you need to make your explanation a bit different so that the marker thinks it's something different and separate. Right, on to the good stuff. A demonstration of exam technique around quality management. So what we've got showing on screen here is a scenario on this side and a requirement. Which bit do you start off by reading? Yes, of course. It's here, isn't it? You start by reading the requirement so that when you're reading the scenario, you know what you're looking for. So we've got to comment on the quality of the planning and performance of the boat company audit for 5 marks. And 5 marks, how many points do we need in the answer? Of course, if it's 5 marks, that means 1 mark per well-explained, well-developed point. To score 4 marks, I need to come up with 5 separate points. So my first thing I always do in a question is I read through and I add notes into my plan. But for this one, just to make it, because this is a simple question, we're just going to start by reading through the scenario. So the audit of boat companies' financial statements for the year ended 30th of July X5 has been completed and the audit report's been signed. So we're right at the end of the audit. And during the year, they won a significant government contract. The audit team was an assistant, that's the most junior auditor, a senior, normally someone who's qualified or almost qualified. The audit assistant could be someone who's on their first day. That's someone very junior. Someone less junior, probably newly qualified, and an audit partner. Okay. The junior and senior, so that's the assistant and the senior, are new to the boat company audit. Also, they've never worked on this client before. But the partner's been in position for a long time, for 9 years. Oh, I'm just locking that away. So they're new. They don't know what they're doing on this client. The audit assistant doesn't know what they're doing in general, and they've never worked on this company before. The audit assistant is basically lost. But the partner's been in position for 9 years. I'm already thinking a potential familiarity threat. If this is a listed client, then that would breach the ethical standards, wouldn't it, being in position for 9 years? But there's nothing up here telling me that they're listed. Okay, so it's not a listed company. Otherwise, they would tell me. And it says there was no audit kickoff meeting. Oh, no audit kickoff meeting, despite the fact that the team are new to the client. Let's just let that bubble away in our minds. And it says revenue was the high risk area. We identified it as high risk during planning. And then the audit assistant did the revenue testing. They performed the same tests that were performed in X4 and concluded that revenue is not materially misstated. Goodness me, there are some problems there. The audit assistant did the work, even though they don't know what they're doing, and this was a high-risk area. And they did the same tests as last year. Why did the auditor cross the road? Because last year's auditor crossed the road. Okay, that's a terrible joke. Please ignore that. But there is a danger with audit that you just follow last year's file. Okay, and the problem of following last year's file is, well, last year's approach is that was relevant last year. But is it relevant this year? Has the business changed? Oh, look, the boat company won a significant government contract during the year. The business has changed. But we did the same thing as last year. And just let that just bubble in our minds a little bit. Then the audit partner visited the audit team on the last day of the audit and did his whole review on that last day. Problem of that, nowhere near enough time to address any issues that he found. But don't worry, he didn't find any issues. No significant review points were noted. The partner was satisfied that the evidence was fine. It supported the conclusions drawn by the audit team. Why might he thought everything was fine? Is it because he didn't have time to draw any issues? Or is it because he's perhaps a bit too close to the client, a bit familiar? Maybe he just assumes everything is correct because he's got this long-standing relationship. And there were no further reviews. Okay, now here's a little bit of exam question insight for you. No, when they say they didn't do something, no kickoff meeting, no further reviews, it's a bit of a sign that those things should have happened. Okay, so watch out for that in a question. Right, so let's start drawing out some points then and planning them. So I'm going to start with the junior and the senior being new to this audit, but we didn't have a kickoff meeting. Okay, that's a problem because these people don't necessarily understand the business and the risks that it's facing. And this led to the audit assistant just following last year's file, doing the same tests, despite the fact that a significant government contract was won during the year. So here's that point planned out. Because there was a lack of kickoff meeting, the new team members, the junior and the assistant and the senior, who lack experience of boat company, might not be aware of what's happening in the business, the up-to-date issues facing boat company. And that meant they didn't update the audit test for revenue, despite the fact that the business has changed and we've won this new government contract. And therefore, the tests that we have performed for revenue might not have been appropriate. That's why it's a quality issue. Excellent. A lot of detail in there for one point, isn't there? But still a really robust point, drawing out several facts. And I'm not frightened to quote the facts in my answer. So kickoff meeting, right? Didn't update the test for revenue. What I'm not doing is just copying and pasting lots of information from the scenario. I'm taking a relevant fact and then using it, developing it. Right, next up, let's talk about revenue being a high risk area. So revenue was identified as high risk, but it was done, the work was done by the most junior auditor who might not have had the skills and experience to do the work. And we know that there was this new government contract and the junior auditor might not have had the skills and experience to be able to identify misstatements with it. So here's that point planned out. Revenue was identified as a high-risk area, but the testing was performed by the most junior auditor, who might lack the knowledge and experience to identify issues, particularly with this new government contract that could have different performance obligations to our standard contracts, and therefore they may overlook misstatements. That is why it's a quality management issue. All right, next up, that's 2 points planned. Next up, oh yeah, the audit partner visited the team on the last day of the audit, way too late, not enough time for him to be able to address any issues. And he did absolutely everything in one day. He basically whizzed through everything. Poor tone at the top. And he didn't find any, or she didn't find any significant review points. So, because the partner reviewed the entire file on the last day, that's demonstrating a lack of professional competence and due care. There's not enough time for the audit team to gather any more evidence if he did find any issues or she found any issues. And there might have been some, for example, around revenue, where we just followed last year's file. And the fact that there wasn't enough time would have contributed to the partner not making any significant review points. See how I'm building linkages between the different facts. Because they did it late and rushed it, they didn't find any review points. Other things that we found in that last paragraph, we talked about there being no further reviews. And if it tells you something didn't happen, it means it should have happened. So we really should have done, what other further review could we have done? Yeah, some sort of independent partner review. That would be a good thing to do. Now, why should one have been done? Well, the audit partner has been in position for 9 years. Okay, there's a potential familiarity threat. They're a bit close to the client. They might assume that things are correct without robustly checking. And they didn't find any significant review points during the audit, which is weird, right? It's always odd if that happens. I mean, it could be that the client's doing everything perfectly, but that's quite unlikely. So the fact the partner didn't find any significant review points suggests that familiarity threat has actually manifested itself. So no further reviews were performed. And I think that's because, despite the partner having been in position for 9 years with a potential familiarity threat, they may have been assuming that no issues would be found. That's why they came out late on the last day. And that's evidenced by them visiting on that last day. So we've got a lack of safeguards here, despite there being a familiarity threat. This is a higher risk audit. So there should have been some sort of independent partner review. Now, this is a 5-mark question. And I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4 points. So surely I need another one. But I've been through the scenario and I haven't got another point. There isn't anything else that jumped out to me from the scenario. So what should you do in this situation? I haven't got enough points for the marks available. Well, the wrong answer is to come up with a fifth point that is rubbish. That is a repeat of one of your other ones where you try to change a little bit of it to make the marker think it's different. Or you come up with one that you don't think is a decent point, but you must have 5 because it's the 5 marks. So you write something that's not very good. Okay. The problem of those, so particularly the second one, right? If you come up with a fifth point that's rubbish, very often students take ages explaining a rubbish point. This point, I know it's not very good, but I'm going to keep explaining it. And if I keep explaining it and I keep going and I keep going, it will become a good point. But it won't. Rubbish will remain rubbish. So if you've got 4 reasonable points, as I have here, and they're all quite developed, right? I've got lots of facts in them. I've got enough here to comfortably pass this question. Right? I only need 3 out of 5 to comfortably pass it, and I've got 4. And I'm pretty sure all 4 of these are good. So I am much better to take my 4 and explain them properly and develop them fully, rather than wasting time trying to come up with a 5th one. Okay, so a good bit of exam technique there. If you've got to near your target number of points and you can't think of another good one, just move on and write up the ones that you have. So let's do that. Here are the ones that we had. Well, up to you how you do this, right? So what I'd quite like you to do is to pause the recording here and write up each of these 4 points, then compare your answer with mine. Or you can just work together with me. So ideally, pause the recording here and write them up yourselves. Okay, hopefully you have already written them up. Now, let's go through them together. So this first one was about there being a lack of kickoff meeting. And so the new team members who don't have experience of the company won't be aware of changes to the business. And this led to them not updating the audit plan for revenue, despite the business having changed with the new government contract. So the lack of kickoff meeting, despite new team members lacking experience of boat. The team may not have been aware of recent issues facing the business, which meant that the audit tests for revenue were not updated. When the business has changed with this new government contract, so the test performed might not have been appropriate. Does anything strike you about the style of my answer there? Look how brief it is. It's almost like notes, isn't it? Can you do that? Surely you have to write in much fuller sentences, don't you? Surely it has to be much more wordy and eloquent English. Well, no. What I'm showing you here is the minimum you can get away with. Right? This is just about acceptable. Okay? Don't write any more briefly than this. But this, you can get away with this level of detail. And you'll notice something else about my answer. Right? I've tried to keep each point short. I've tried to use full stops. I could have used a comma here, okay, and made this a longer sentence. But putting a full stop adds break, and it makes the marker more likely to identify that I'm moving into a separate point. Okay, so wherever possible, try and avoid commas and try and include full stops. You can't avoid the odd comma, but try and avoid long, complicated clausal sentences. Right, on to the second one. Revenue is high risk, but it was done by the junior auditor, despite there being a high risk area around this new government contract with potentially different performance obligations, and therefore we might have overlooked misstatements. So, revenue was a high risk R. High risk R? Shouldn't it have been, a high risk area? Shouldn't I go and correct my spelling mistake? Aha, no, because small spelling mistakes are absolutely fine in AAA. You don't get marked down for them. So even if I spot that when I'm reviewing my own answer, I don't go back and change it because it's clear what I'm talking about. Revenue is high risk, but testing was performed by the most junior auditor. They may lack the knowledge and experience to identify misstatements, particularly around the new government contract, which could have different performance obligations to other contracts. Oh, I've broken my own rule a bit here, haven't I? I've got 2 commas in the same sentence. Ideally, I'd break that up a little bit more, but I still think it's reasonably clear. Misstatements may have been overlooked. Right, on to this third point, partner reviewing the entire file on the last day, which means they didn't do the work properly, and that's why they didn't find any significant review points. So the partner reviewed the entire file on the last day, showing a lack of professional competence and due care. There would be insufficient time for the audit team to gather more evidence. For example, performing more testing over revenue. See how I'm linking to other facts again. Now, I know I said don't repeat yourself. Right, but I'm not repeating myself. I'm linking to the same issue, but it's not the same point that I'm making. And that contributed to there being no significant review points. On to the last one, which is we should have done an independent partner review because of this familiarity threat. No further reviews were performed, despite the partner having been in position for 9 years. The partner may be overly familiar with BoatCo, demonstrated by assuming no issues would be found, hence reviewing on the last day. Inadequate safeguards were in place. An independent partner review should have been performed. Now, this is not a perfect answer. Right? A perfect answer would have had 5 points. A perfect answer would perhaps have developed a little bit more in a few places. But what I'm showing you here is a practical answer. Okay, this is the kind of thing that you can do under the time pressure of the exam, still building in high quality things by including lots of linkages between different facts in the scenario to add depth to your point. I hope you found this session useful. Thanks for sticking with it to the end, and best of luck with the rest of your AAA studies.